What's up, everybody, and welcome to Read the Bible with me. I'm Stan Jr., and today we're looking at chapter 17 of the book of 1 Samuel. If you're new here, go ahead and click subscribe to this channel and turn on your notification bells. We read the Bible every single day, and so you're going to want to be notified when I post a new video each day. And if you're a Bible Club member, thank you so much for your $10 a month support. I cannot do this ministry without you. We can't send Bibles around the world, and we can't send missionaries around the world. Every month we do this through a ministry called Voices of Martyrs. And so, thank you for your support and continued support. If you're a Bible Club member, click like on this video and leave a comment below. Let's get started with this chapter because we got a lot to read today. And so it says, Now the Philistines, verse 1 of 17. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, and which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in the line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath at Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin on a bronze slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of the Ephraite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And in that day Saul, the man, was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. So now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of Philistines, and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man fled from him, were much afraid of him. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, So shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness with? And now I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him and toward another and spoke to the same. And people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So David, when he encountered this huge obstacle in his life, when he encountered this threat for his life and for his people's life, he remembered the testimony of God. He remembered what God had done for him before. And that's the first strategy of spiritual warfare. You've got to recall the testimony that what has God done for me beforehand? What has God already done in my life? When I encounter this next great mountain, you can think to yourself, okay, God, I know that you're a God that has done this for me. You've done that for me. So I can believe you for the future. That's what David did. The Bible says that we overcome with the word of our testimony and the blood of the Lamb. So our testimony is a powerful mechanism to raise our faith in God. And Saul said to David, Go, and let the Lord be with you. And Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. And then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, and his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give you the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Here's the second step for spiritual warfare. It is to fight for the victory of God. We are fighting because we want God to have the victory. We want God to get the credit. We want God to get the glory at the end of the day. We want people to know that there is a God that loves them and that wants to save them. And so that happens when we fight on behalf of God. We fight for God. We fight with God on his accord. God is fighting for us, of course, but we want him to get the victory in our lives. We don't want people to think we're better. We don't want people to think we're smarter. We don't want people to think we're greater. We want them to know that it is God fighting for us and that God has won the victory. And so he says to him there, when and he says, God angel, he said, and all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in David's hand. And then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off the head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shevaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, and he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and the head of the Philistine in his head. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And that was chapter 17 of the book of 1 Samuel. Thank you so much for reading with me today. If you'd like to support this ministry, please click the link in my description and you'll be able to become a patron for $10 a month. Help us send Bibles. Help us send missionaries around the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't thank you enough for those that are already doing that. So generous of you, and I'm grateful for every single donation. All right, God bless you. I will see you tomorrow. We'll be looking at chapter 18 in the book of 1 Samuel. Peace.